interrupt the conversation. Whether we're on schedule or not, we're going to start this second panel. I'm Jason Gourmet. I run the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I get the opportunity to at least establish the beginning of the tone for this conversation. I want to start out with the proud acknowledgement that I am a swamp dweller, and I think that we have a remarkable moment of disruption in our democracy that might allow us to do things that we have talked about for more than a couple of generations and actually failed to achieve. I think the greatest risk is the exuberance of grievance. So if one thinks about the tone of this conversation right now, it really is vested in frustration and grievance. As we talked a little bit about in the first panel, that is often not the way to effectuate better management. And so I want to at least give ourselves a little bit of pause of reflection. I think the first panel was exceptional in part because even though it was a broad topic, it was a focused topic. I think our panel, which is ostensibly going to talk broadly about rethinking executive authority and oversight, runs the risk of having just a dramatically seductive rhetorical conversation about the inadequacies of the bureaucracy that will make us feel slightly better for 90 days. And then essentially have us talking 4 years about how the next administration can move this process forward. So that is my plea. My point of entry into this discussion, while we're going to talk mostly about how one kind of reins in this incredibly complex administrative state, is to talk a little bit about how we might actually empower the bureaucracy to make better decisions at the outset so that we have a less deep hole to fill. And I'm going to start at 80,000 feet and maybe get down to 40,000 feet and then introduce our panel. But in my humble opinion, there is an insatiable desire for transparency, however understood, that is actually, in a very significant way, diminishing the deliberative capacity of our government, executive and congressional branch, but particularly executive branch, to solve problems. While I run the Bipartisan Policy Center, I can tell you that I think bipartisan legislation brings out the very best and the very worst of Congress. When we have an effort that really brings forward different opinions and in a principled way reconciles different views and has that kind of e pluribus unum, that's fantastic. When Congress, in kind of a populist fury, decides just to beat up on itself, often that gets you 90 votes in the Senate too, that doesn't tend to, in fact, move us in the direction that I would like to see. And I think there is some bipartisanship there. If you look at the post-Watergate can't trust government mood, and then watch the influx of the Reagan 9 scariest words in the English language, I'm the government and I'm here to help, there was quite a cabal of disdain for our own democratic process. And I think that actually has resulted in a number of issues that are leading to bad decisions. And I just want to kind of emphasize again, we're talking about changing the management of our government. Many of us in the room, I think, are probably managers. In my experience, rising above the grievance and pointing for a real direction is often much more effective than criticizing your employees as just being lazy and dumb. So I would suggest that the problem we have in our bureaucracy is largely good people with very bad incentives. And if we approach the conversation in that way and acknowledge that the incentives are leading to very foolish behavior and we need to change the incentives rather than just tossing out the alligators, I think we'll make more progress. But so let me take it down to 30,000 feet in my last 90 seconds. I believe that the opposite of transparency is privacy, not corruption. And I think there are a number of aspects of our executive branch decision-making which actually imply the opposite. The Federal Advisory Committee Act is just a joke. I've talked to many people who have participated in these efforts, and they almost to a one indicate that the strictures of the dialogue could not be better designed to prevent dialogue. The notion that you cannot have a single meaningful conversation that is not, in fact, a public conversation fundamentally violates the way people have conversations. I often try to personalize it by indicating that my wife and I, just around this time of year, occasionally have a discussion about whose in-laws we should visit over the holidays. It would be a very different discussion if our in-laws were in the room. And I think that is reflective of what tends to happen in these processes. Even the suggestion that two members of a faculty committee can't travel on an airplane together because they might be violating the public access to the decision, I think is kind of nutty. The sunshine laws and quorum laws, again, you know, sunshine's nice. I wrote a book with a chapter called The Dark Side of Sunshine. Again, as was suggested, we often tend to just drive the decision-making deeper underground if we fundamentally make it impossible for people to have those real kinds of negotiations. Talk to people at the state and federal level where they'll have one meeting and then they'll go off separately. They'll do all their work independently. They'll have one more meeting to put it back together just to avoid the inept conversations that happen when everybody is posturing for cameras. The Freedom of Information Act, and again, I'm not suggesting we do away with any of these things. It's just a question of calibration. The basic conversation with folks in executive branch agencies is never write anything down, particularly anything which they think might dissent from what they perceive to be the political agenda of the agency. That's not a good way to have deliberation. And again, you know, how you perfect these things matters. The idea that we're going to start demanding the text messages of executive branch, leaders. The difference between a text message and a phone call now is irrelevant. I think we would be uncomfortable tapping the phones of all of our secretaries, but somehow we think that if it was a text and not a call, that's somehow information we should have access to. And lastly, the self-inflicted incompetence, right? So the appointments process discourages a lot of the best people from wanting to have anything to do with public service. And this "eek, I see a lobbyist" kind of populist hysteria excludes some of the best people from government service. And so if you roll that all together, I think there are a lot of ways that we could actually improve the quality of the decision-making to diminish, to some extent, the significant changes in oversight that I believe this excellent panel might talk about. And so if I can now introduce, and I think many of these folks are known to you all, but Chris DeMuth with the Hudson Institute, David Schoenbrod with New York Law, Susan Dudley with GW, Orrin Cass with the Manhattan Institute, our recidivist panelist, Don Elliott, and Bill Galston with Brookings. I'm going to ask each folks to, just like the last panel, say a few words, and then we'll have a short conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. President-elect Trump may not be a full-spectrum deregulator in the Ronald Reagan tradition. He hasn't had much to say about the FDA or the FCC, two favorite targets of regulatory reformers. There are some indications he may be an antitrust activist, but he's made it clear that economic growth and business and job formation are his relentless top domestic priorities, and that reform of tax and regulatory policies will be his primary paths to those objectives. In regulatory policy, his administration is going to be results-oriented, focusing on dramatic reductions in energy, environmental, and labor market regulation, easing permitting restrictions on transportation, pipeline, other infrastructure projects, and reforms of financial regulation to encourage business lending. The administration's initial regulatory actions are going to be executive actions. President Trump is likely to do some immediate things on his own, such as approving the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines, which would be akin to President Reagan's instant decontrol of petroleum prices in highlighting his distinctive priorities. He will issue a passel of new executive orders. There will be directives to the regulatory agencies to postpone the effective dates of late-term Obama administration rules and to revise those and others with an eye toward recession or revision. The new managements at the regulatory agencies will take immediate aim at the clean power, waters of the United States, labor overtime rules, and others that are either legally dubious or at odds with President Trump's economic goals, or both. Congress may help with strategic use of the Congressional Procedure Act. There will be efforts to radically liberalize federal permitting, environmental impact statements. It is likely, however, that efforts to reform or relax growth-inhibiting regulations through administrative action will fall well short of President Trump's huge ambitions. Many of the worst regulatory excesses are deeply embedded in agency cultures and in statutory law. The EPA's approach to environmental protection, for example, is command and control regulation of every jot and tittle of industrial production, an approach that freezes technology, suppresses economic incentives and innovation. The Obama administration's devotion to green energy and suspicion of private markets has greatly reinforced these tendencies, and the agency has sometimes exhibited shocking indifference to economic and public health evidence and individual rights. So Administrator Scott Pruitt is going to be in a hostile working environment from day one, but no matter how well he masters the bureaucratic ropes, he will still be dealing with decades-old, seriously obsolete statutes, such as the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which will severely limit the possibilities of sensible reform. As much could be said of the energy, labor, and transportation agencies and statutes. In these circumstances, the Trump administration's reform ambitions will require legislative collaboration. Yet the legislative initiatives currently being talked about, such as reforming the Administrative Procedure Act, enacting something like the REINS Act, will be of limited immediate help because they are focused on future regulatory actions. So I want to suggest, as a response to this dilemma, a variant of the REINS procedure based on executive initiative rather than legislative reaction. REINS stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. The REINS bills, which passed the House twice or three times in recent years, required that major agency regulations pass both houses of Congress under expedited procedures and up or down floor votes before they can take effect. REINS enactments require the President's signature, as for all statutory law, but this is a foregone conclusion for regulations he had submitted in the first place. REINS has been styled as an effort to rein in unaccountable bureaucrats, but it has two important features that have received very little notice and in fact have been treated when noticed as unfortunate complications. REINS-approved rules would be statutory law. That means, first, that they would be subject to judicial review only on constitutional grounds. They would short-circuit the routine and lengthy administrative law challenges under the APA or the agency's organic statutes, such as the Clean Air Act. Second, they would be capable of amending the organic statutes. So if an EPA rule established policies that departed from the Clean Air Act, say by focusing on emissions outputs with limits and economic incentives, substituting them for the current input-oriented engineering and operating controls. Or if OSHA did the same thing with workplace safety reforms similar to those proposed by Philip Howard in his Post piece this morning, legislative enactment of those rules under REINS would effectively amend the Clean Air and OSHA statutes. So I want to propose that these features be employed in a new one that, just for fun, I'm going to call reform, referrals from the executive for regulatory modernization. Under reform, the President himself would refer major regulatory initiatives to the House and Senate and request their prompt consideration and approval. When the rules departed from the requirements of established statutes, the President would note those departures and how reform approvals would amend the statutory framework, and the amendments would be enacted along with the implementing rules. The process would not involve expedited legislative procedures or up or down votes. I'll be through in just a moment, which would require congressional pre-commitment as under REINS and the precedents such as the military base closing and trade liberalization exercises. That would be fine for me, to leave established procedures in place. David Schoenbrod may explain that. But there is also already a bit of political precedent for the President's asking Congress to share responsibility for important regulatory decisions. For example, there's talk of President Trump submitting the Paris Climate Change Agreement to the Senate for treaty consideration rather than withdrawing or revising it on his own. I would like briefly to offer three arguments for this reform procedure. First, it would be a stab at developing a new executive-legislative interaction mechanism that balances the executive's advantages of initiative and policy specialization with Congress's advantages of a general perspective and representation. The controversies and failures of President Obama's efforts to circumvent Congress through unilateral actions illustrates the need for such innovation. The Raines proposal, military base closing exercises, may be seen as early efforts to conceive of new methods of collaboration. Reform would build on them. Second, as I said, the major organic statutes are mostly very old, badly obsolete, yet efforts to modernize them en masse as entire statutes have repeatedly failed. Professor Schoenbrod worked with environmental and industry groups and academics to develop a superb set of proposals for reforming the Clean Air Act. I have sat with him as he has described his plans to congressional leaders and watched them seize up in horror at the prospect of such a Herculean task. But under reform, Clean Air Act reform would proceed incrementally in legislatively digestible bits, and most importantly, at an intensely practical level. Statutory reforms would not be abstract propositions, but accompanied by rules that demonstrated their concrete implementation. Third and finally, President Trump is not only an ambitious and results-oriented fellow, he's also apparently an impatient man. If reform procedures worked, they would achieve reforms that were both deeper and faster than those limited by those done by the executive branch under the organic statutes and the APA. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. I'm David Schoenbrod. The Constitution dealt with the conflict between those who would benefit from regulations and those who would be burdened by regulations by giving the power to issue regulations to a Congress in which its members would be accountable to both those who benefit and those who are burdened. So these members of Congress will get credit for the benefits and blame for the burdens. Such a regulatory process would tend to produce balanced decisions. I emphasize tend. And so it was, but only in part. Congress, from early on, gave authority over some of the regulations to agencies. But the agencies, too, had their reasons for wanting to reach balanced results oftentimes, and so it was. Okay, so, but this began to change around 1970. In that year, Congress passed a Clean Air Act that denied the agency, EPA in this case, the flexibility to balance benefits and burdens. Rather, what it did is it purported to grant citizens an ironclad, judicially enforceable right to healthy air and gave the agency the duty to impose the burdens needed to fulfill the right. In this way, Congress got credit for the promised benefits and blame for the burdens. The statute passed almost unanimously because members of Congress could agree that they wanted the credit and they didn't want the blame, not because they agreed about what should be done about pollution. And Congress used a similar approach in many subsequent statutes. Now, this regulatory process cannot reach balanced decisions. Congress promises benefits without regard to the burdens, and meanwhile, individual politicians lobby agencies not to impose excessive burdens, which results in broken promises, which makes people feel betrayed, which results in Congress promising yet more benefits in excruciating detail. So we have a Clean Air Act that's grown from a few dozen pages to 500, 600 pages, depending on how many words you put on the page, but we all know it's immense. and the same is true of many of these other statutes. So the upshot is this vicious circle that whoops, we went too far here. I don't know how that happened. It was too much fun to skip this. Okay, I don't know. Anyway, it's not working. This is the vicious circle that Stephen Breyer talks about in his book, Beyond the Vicious Circle. The vicious circle works great for legislatures, and here's why. They can blame the agencies for both the burdens and the broken promises. So some legislators can be against pollution killing children. Other legislators can be against regulations killing jobs, and none of them have to take responsibility for the inevitable trade-offs, right? And so because this status quo, this schizophrenic approach to regulation is so great for Congress, it fails to update the statutes, even though they are full of specifics that have grown obsolete, and they block ways of regulating that would bring more benefits at less cost. I mean, the Clean Air Act, not amended for 26 years, even though it's very detailed. Okay? So this is a government which is both inept and dishonest. It's a swamp. Swamp is the right word for this, okay? So to drain the swamp, we need to make agencies responsible to Congress and Congress meaningfully responsible to voters, okay? James Landis, a longtime advisor to Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, showed how to do this. He proposed that major regulations be approved or disapproved through the legislative process. That way, wrote Landis, the agency would be the technical agent in the initiation of rules of conduct, yet at the same time, Congress would share in the responsibility for their adoption. Stephen Breyer showed how through a variation on the base closing idea, Congress can be made to vote up or down on these regulations by a statutory deadline. Okay. I think this is the way to go. The REINS Act has the trappings of the Landis-Breyer approach, but is transformed from a serious way to make Congress accountable into a bunch of posturing for being against regulation. It's the vicious circle all over again, around the clock again, okay? I would be happy to discuss ways of making the Landis-Breyer idea into a practical reality. Replacing REINS is a proposal. And I've written a book that talks about, coming out pretty soon, that talks about how to do so as well. But to sum up, making the legislators and the president personally responsible for the major regulations would give agencies an incentive to develop balanced regulations. It would also, because then in turn the members of Congress would be responsible for voting on these proposals, it would be in the interest of Congress to amend the statutes to allow the agencies to propose more sensible ideas, and it would make Congress interested in changing, adopting many of the good reform ideas that we've heard about here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy also to be standing in front of a sign that says "Drain the Swamp." So I think Chris and David made very good arguments for making Congress more accountable for the policies that are issued through regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and also about the executive branch. In addition to something like REINS or reform or modified version of REINS, Congress just needs more expertise. So I think an office, a Congressional Office of Regulatory Oversight or Review or Analysis would be important. And I think the arguments for it are the same as the arguments for the Congressional Budget Office. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is a terrific, professional, reliable staff, but as is the budget side of OMB, but that doesn't mean that Congress doesn't need its own expertise. It's part of the checks and balances in our system. I think OIRA review of agencies' regulations is constrained by three limitations that wouldn't constrain a congressional office. One is that OIRA maximizes net benefits to the extent allowed by law. And as Chris pointed out, a lot of the statutes don't allow that kind of analysis. Second, OIRA doesn't review independent agencies' regulations. A congressional office wouldn't be constrained by that. And third, OIRA serves the president, which is appropriate and something that it should do, but sometimes the OIRA's objective analytical expertise has to defer to a president's priorities. So that's my one addition to making Congress more accountable. Now I'm going to talk about some executive reforms that President-elect Trump could make without Congress. This is based on 10 recommendations, policy recommendations for regulatory reform that the Regulatory Studies Center we just posted last week. So if you're interested in more detail, go there, but I probably have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to not give you all 10. The first is that the president should retain the executive orders that are currently in place. They have been issued by President Clinton and President Obama, and keeping them, and they are sound. So rather than tossing them out and writing a new executive order, which would be bound to stir up controversy, he should stick with those because they send a strong bipartisan message that regulatory analysis and regulatory oversight is consistent across parties. We just need to take it seriously. The one change I would do is I would extend it to independent regulatory agencies. Second, increase OIRA's resources. OIRA's workload has increased since it was formed in 1981 when Chris headed it. The regulatory agency staff has increased dramatically since that time, but OIRA's staff has is dropped in about half. So OIRA needs more staff. It now has less than 50 people reviewing all the regulations of the executive branch. The third broad category is we need more rigorous regulatory analysis, and we have several recommendations on that. One is better ex-ante analysis, probably earlier in the process, that gets more public input. Second, more transparent assumptions about what go into that analysis, particularly risk assessments that are the basis for environment, safety, and health risks. And then we also need to do a better job of ex post analysis. We have a tendency to do all of our research on a regulation before we really know anything about it, and then we rarely go back to look at whether our assumptions, et cetera, were really accurate. So I think better ex post analysis, kind of testing those hypotheses, is necessary to close that feedback loop. And then finally, benefit cost analysis, which has been the theme of regulatory analysis for the last 30+ years, is very important, but it is by its nature a central planning exercise. And we need to pay more attention to the benefits that competition brings in regulating behavior. And too often regulation actually undermines competition rather than realizing what competition is there and what it might do. So I think we have several recommendations related to this. One is that for each new regulation, we really should look at how will this affect competition. Maybe that would be housed in OIRA or an expanded OIRA. Or it might be the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice Antitrust Division could have that responsibility for looking at the competitive impacts of regulation. Second, there should be a lot more deference to states. At the state level, there can be more experimentation. We can learn from that. We talk a lot about, in regulation we can't do randomized controlled trials, but we can do quasi-experiments if we allow the different states to try different procedures and see how that works. And finally, we need to respect consumer choice. So often regulations are justified with very large benefits on the assumption that that the government knows better than you do as an individual what will make you better off. So it's not because it's protecting the environment, something that's a broader goal that none of us individually would necessarily work towards, but that it will put more money in your pocket and therefore you're making the wrong choice, and we will improve your welfare by taking away your choices and supplanting them with our regulatory choice. So if you're interested in more, please go to our website and take a look at our 10 recommendations.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am actually a recovering management consultant, and so I think perhaps bring a slightly different perspective to some of these questions, because management consultants frankly do a lot of things poorly. One thing I think they are actually very good at is managing things. And in particular, something I came to believe through my time in that profession is that it is in fact decisions, not structure, that determine how well an organization works. And I've been pleasantly surprised moving into the government context to see that I actually think legal and regulatory thinkers have that right. A lot of the discussion today we've heard is about who should make the decisions, whereas in the corporate context, you see a lot more obsession about moving the org chart boxes around. Who should make the decisions is the right question. The problem that has left me dumbstruck as I began my work in administrative law is that the answer that the administrative state has chosen is let's make it as messy and confused as possible. If you want to get good decisions, you need to have clear lines of authority and accountability, not just with respect to a given permit, but with respect to how the organization operates overall. And what we seem to have in the administrative state today is a very strange compromise to the contrary, which is to say that Congress and the judiciary have decided they want to dump as much power and authority into the executive as possible, but they're not actually comfortable with the authority there, so they also want to dump as much confusion and ambiguity as to who is going to actually get to make those decisions. And I think that's clearest with respect to OIRA. We're now in the 5th decade of the president and the White House offices trying to establish some control over these agencies, and yet we are still operating under the fiction that the president has no directive authority over the agencies. You can go back to the original 1789 congressional debates in which James Madison was arguing that obviously the president must have the removal authority. You can look at the recent judicial decisions about CFPB, where courts are finally saying some of this mess you're throwing into the executive is obviously unacceptable. And yet we still have in the executive orders from OIRA, or establishing OIRA, the endless caveats only to the extent permitted by law. This is always review. This is always oversight. It's never actually the White House telling the agencies what to do. And I think that's wrong, and I think it's in some senses the original sin underlying a lot of the challenges that we see with how the administrative state is operating and how the regulatory process moves forward. So what I would suggest as a perhaps 180,000-foot reform is that we need to dispense with the fiction that the president does not control the agencies. Legally, I think there is an ironclad basis for that, and this also comes from my private sector perspective, where nobody asks whether a CEO has directive authority over his organization. There's no such thing in what I will call the real world as directive authority. If a terrible marketing plan comes up, the CEO can't direct in some legally cognizable way a better marketing plan. That's not the tool by which an organization is managed. Management occurs through the very tools that everyone agrees the president already has: the power of removal, the power of influencing budgets, the powers of promotion and demotion, the powers of setting the organizational structure. And so based on that, it seems to me there's no need to fight about the fiction of whether the directive authority exists. It's better to simply assert it. Conflicts will arise, just as they do in private sector organizations. They will have to be resolved messily, just as they are in private sector organizations. But the reality is that if you do that, you create an incredible amount of clarity. And so I think the first thing that is needed is an executive order that simply establishes the president needs to sign any major regulation before it goes into the Federal Register. I think it's very unlikely an agency would ever challenge that. And if it did, I think the president would be on very firm legal ground. I think OIRA needs to approve every other regulation before it goes in the Federal Register. And if you do that, you reshape OIRA not as a fictional faux oversight group, but as the nerve center of the regulatory state. That doesn't take over everything the federal government does. Most of what agencies have always been supposed to do is not about rulemaking. It is about the machinery of the federal government, and the agencies would continue to play that role. But to the extent that what the federal government is doing is making rules, and Congress and the judiciary want to give it that power, that should be controlled centrally through the president and through an OIRA-like organization. That would also enable a regulatory budget, which I think works far more effectively if it's managed within the executive than if Congress attempts to impose it, and we can talk more about how that might look. And then the final thing I'll say is that this is not a proposal for the net aggrandizement of the executive. I'd say what we have today is a system that you could call concentrated and confused power, and we need a different equilibrium that says that we are going to have limited but efficient power. I think if the president actually did properly assert authority over the rulemaking process, you would have some hydraulic effects automatically, such as the judiciary probably removing a lot of the Chevron deference that might be appropriate to agency expertise, but would not be appropriate to a political directive from the White House. And I think over time you would also hope and expect that Congress and the judiciary would have to rethink what kind of power they want to place into an executive that is being properly and efficiently managed. Thank you.
Well, I find myself largely in agreement with most of the suggestions that my colleagues on the panel have made. I, like many of them, am going to talk a little bit about the problem of the unaccountable bureaucracy, or as David Schoenbrod said, how do we make agencies more responsible to Congress? The usual strategy, and we've heard several variations of it from the panel today, is to make one of the political branches, either the Congress or the president, make political decisions on top of the decisions that the agency has made. I want to explore the other strategy, which is to accept the existence of the administrative state, to accept the existence of the millions of bureaucrats who are going to be making decisions, and ask the question of how do we make them more democratically responsible. This is what's called in the academic literature the democracy deficit. I love that kind of clinical term, the democracy deficit. But just to put it in perspective, when I was at EPA, there were 50 political appointees, not just presidential appointees, but Schedule Cs, and 15,000 career bureaucrats who essentially had lifetime tenure. Now, my friend Philip Howard wants me to acknowledge that he thinks civil service is unconstitutional. But leaving that aside, how do we make those people who, in my view, as a practical matter, are going to be making most of the decisions most of the time, how do we make them more democratically responsible? I think what we're dealing with here is really the aftermath of what I think is the worst separation of powers decision of the 20th century, and that's saying a lot. That's the Chadha decision in 1984 that got rid of the legislative veto. All of these ideas, and I must say, I think Chris DeMuth's idea of reform is really very, very interesting, and I like it a lot. I disagree with them a little bit in the sense that I think a lot of the problems are not really determined or required by the statutes. And I think Paul Noe is going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we could interpret statutes to have more flexibility. But here's my idea. My idea is what I call term limits for bureaucrats. And the idea is that the senior executive service, good people with bad incentives, which are the level just below the presidential appointees. There are about 7,000 barons, office directors in the federal government, that those people should be appointed for 6-year terms and subject to a retention vote by the Congress. Now that actually works. There are enough congressional committees that it would mean each congressional committee would have to look at about 20 appointees a year. And in order to make it constitutional, I would say that the Congress has to make an affirmative vote to retain them. And the idea is that people in government would be less likely to make decisions that are politically unacceptable if they knew they would have to come before the Congress. Ben Sass recently said, members of the judiciary have to come before the people once in their career. Members of the House once every 2 years, members of the Senate once every 6 years. Most of the federal bureaucrats, never. Now, I don't think it's practical to have retention elections although we have a lot of retention elections for state Supreme Court justices. But I do believe that rather than trying to force the president or Congress to make more of the decisions, what we should do is make at least the senior members of the bureaucracy more accountable to the Congress. Now, there's a flaw in this. There are probably several flaws, but there's one that I'm aware of, and that is that the senior executive service still doesn't have a great deal of authority over the level of career bureaucrats below them. But at least I think it would be a positive step forward to make the bureaucracy more accountable to the Congress.
In fact, I will be least, because unlike the previous speakers, I have no precise reform proposal to put on the table. In my defense, I have a reason for my failure, and that is I believe that when it comes to regulation, we don't have a management problem or even an institutional problem. I think we have a governance problem which is rooted in conceptual, historical, and even constitutional issues. So I want to spend my 5 minutes expanding on that theme. Let me begin first with a quote from James Madison, my favorite founder. This is from 1799. Quote, "If nothing more were required in exercising a legislative trust than a general conveyance of authority without laying down any precise rule by which authority conveyed should be carried into effect, it would follow that the whole power of legislation might be transferred by the legislature." I think Madison was absolutely right about that. He regarded that as a reductio ad absurdum of the whole idea of delegation without some precise rule guiding the delegation. In a very interesting article by Eric Posner and Adrian Vermeule entitled "Interring the Non-Delegation Doctrine," they seize the nettle firmly and say that Madison's reductio would in fact be an acceptable result. I think that Madison was right, and the Chicago boys are wrong. Now let me run the reel forward about 129 years to the decision of Hampton versus the United States in 1928, with Chief Justice Taft writing for the court. And here's what Taft said: "So long as Congress shall lay down by legislative act an intelligible principle by which the person or body authorized to exercise the delegated authority is directed to conform, such legislative action is not a forbidden delegation of legislative power." As the attentive among you will have noticed, there's a lot of daylight between Madison's precise rule and Taft's intelligible principle. For example, safeguard public health with a reasonable margin of safety certainly states an intelligible principle. It certainly does not state a precise rule. What I want to suggest is that the Congress of the United States is the root of the problem because it has gotten into the habit of passing legislation revolving around, at most, intelligible principles, but nothing close to precise rules. And I think that as an institutional, conceptual, and constitutional matter, we need to look for a sustainable middle ground between what Madison laid down in one era of American government and what we're now wrestling with in contemporary American government. And we need, this is not to say that we should go back to the Schechter case, but we do need to rethink, not just as a technical matter, but as a conceptual and constitutional matter, what, if any, are the limits of delegation. Because if we don't do that, we will be trying to put a cover on a container of boiling water. No matter how much pressure we exert on the cover, it will either blow off or the pot will blow up. And so it is too late to try to rein in regulations after the underlying statute necessitates them. Which brings me to my second and last point. I think that the objectives and motives of the Dodd-Frank bill were honorable, appropriate, and necessary. But the Dodd-Frank rule mandated 390 separate rulemaking processes. The firm Davis Polk monitors the progress of Dodd-Frank on a quarterly basis. The last report I consulted, it is more than 6 years after the passage of Dodd-Frank. More than 30% of the mandated processes have not been met with final rules, and in more than 20% of the mandated processes, no rule has even been proposed. I think this is something like the Waterloo of the modern doctrine of general statements which then are cashed out into mandated rulemaking processes. I don't think we can go on this way and have effective governance. We need to rethink what it means to pass a law. And if and only if we do that, will any of these other proposals be actionable and effective, in my opinion. Thank you.
I will note that we have really a lot of very specific ideas grounded in rich, substantive, and actually constitutional history. I will also note that, like a casino or an institution that bills by the hour, there are no clocks in the room. So I would look to someone to tell us how much time.
About 10 minutes.
10 glorious minutes. Let's go right then to questions, and if you can go right to the mic, please.
Let's see. I'm Michael Burling with American Enterprise Institute, the Washington Examiner. Bill Galston mentioned one of my favorite Supreme Court unanimous decisions, Schechter Poultry. My question is, which as I recall, the court ruled unanimously that delegation run riot is unconstitutional. Is Schechter Poultry good law? Could there be a line of cases developed that would or should assess things that sort of delegations that have been described?
Counsel? Schechter is good law. It's never been overruled. It was cited favorably, one might say decisively, by William O. Douglas in a Supreme Court decision in the 1970s. Regulation run riot was Justice Cardozo, who was one of the progressives. He wasn't one of the old ancient people on the court. And it was decided before the Administrative Procedure Act was ever passed. But they simply asked the chicken producers, meaning the big producers, and certainly not including the kosher chicken families in Brooklyn, to come up with a code. And I think that if the executive branch used such a procedure today, it would be held unconstitutional. So I think it's still good law, and I think that if Bill Galston went back and looked at the case, he'd find that it's not as bad as the high school history textbooks said.
Jump to the next question.
Yes, John Harrington, Sheffield Corporation from Boston. And I'm cognizant of Philip's title, which is Drain the Swamp. And I'm not trying to offend any members of the panel, but I only heard one comment about draining the swamp from any of you, and it was from Mr. Elliott with regards to a problem which I believe I'm just a simple citizen. I haven't crossed the Potomac in 3 years. Last time I was here, I was thrown out of the Senate. But when I saw the title, I decided to come. And you made a comment, which I believe nobody's in any of the panels today has given any recognition as to why Mr. Trump was elected. The populace is not overly happy. And the populace is cognizant that Congress doesn't have to live by the rest of the rules that the rest of us have to. And I would make a comment to everybody. I said this to 2 major law firms in New York yesterday. None of us are in compliance with anything, any day, anymore. Okay? You're all out of compliance. I'm out of compliance every day, no matter how hard we try. You cannot possibly be in compliance. Okay? The other thing is, people are cognizant that civil services cannot be fired. It's a problem in many of the states. I live in Massachusetts. It's a sewer, and it's a major problem here. The last thing I heard, Professor, your last comment, I'm raised capital for companies. The Dodd-Frank is a disaster. But you made a comment about we shouldn't pass laws that make no sense. And that's really what I believe the American people are saying. So, what I've heard was you're all wanting to create more swamps. And so I would love you, Mr. Elliott, who made a comment about beginning another component of draining the swamps. Trump's idea of forcing people to sign 5-year agreements that they will not lobby for 5 years. My attitude is take the 66,000 registered lobbyists in this town and ship them out of here, because they're not helping the American people. So that idea of signing you cannot serve unless you sign a document that you cannot lobby for 5 years, you can never lobby for a foreign government. That's a beginning. Your idea, which I thought would be outstanding, is making those people accountable. What are now the 3 wealthiest counties in America? Anybody care any idea?
Washington area.
Yeah. All happened in the last 8 years. When you begin to develop that, it's a disaster. And so, sorry for my rant, but I would love to have your comments about other ideas like that, where we create, even Mr. Katz, I think I heard you saying, enough. Enough. We don't need more agencies. We don't need more regulations. The American people, if you listen to them, they want it to end. They don't want Washington to continue to grow like a monster. And you guys need to come up with ideas and articulate them to the rest of us, which we can get behind, whether it's on infrastructure, regulatory reform, and finance, and all, or the Trump administration will fail like all others because you get drowned by the environment. So, thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'll try to answer it. I think a lot of the answer is in the work of Philip Howard, particularly his most recent book, The Rule of Nobody. And what he argues in that book is that we've stopped trusting people to make decisions and be responsible for the decisions. And we try to control everything with very, very detailed laws and regulations, of which I think Dodd-Frank is an example. And recently I ran across a quote from Chesterton which said that when you forget about the big laws, you don't lose democracy, you get a whole slew of little laws. And I think that's really kind of where we are. That we're trying to eliminate human responsibility and decision-making. We've carried the rule of law much too far. And that's why we've created this situation where in like Dodd-Frank, you have to have 169, 379, whatever it is, very, very detailed rules. And the difficulty is that the rules are made by what is sometimes referred to in the trade as 3 smart guys in the room. You get 3 smart guys in a room, or men or women, and they come up with something that sounds good in the abstract, and it doesn't really necessarily work in practice. And that's our problem, is that we're getting much too bound by very, very detailed laws and regulations, and that has to be swept aside. And I'll leave it there. But I refer everyone to Philip's 4 great books, but particularly The Rule of Nobody is really a terrific book.
Just wanted to add a thought?
Yeah, I thought it was a rant. I thought it was a charming rant, but it was a rant. The people on this panel have proposed to abolish the civil service system. Okay? You said nobody has anything to say about draining the swamp. People want to reverse the Supreme Court's permitting Congress to engage in the bad behavior that David Schoenbrod characterizes of just saying, we're against discrimination against the handicapped, you guys downtown figure it out. He wants to put an end to that. Bill Galston agrees. I want to have a way that we can expeditiously make deep amendments going beyond anything that Ronald Reagan ever attempted in reforming the regulatory statutes. We may be wrong, but the idea that nobody up here had anything to say about making deep and radical changes, it doesn't fit with what I heard. People up here are as opposed to the situation, sir, as you are, but we also try to think about some specifics. For example, your one proposal is taking all lobbyists in Washington and shipping them away. That proposal runs into a problem called the First Amendment. You want to amend the First Amendment and take away the people's right to petition for a redress of grievances. To abolish lobbying, you have to do that. So you kind of have to face some complexities. I don't think we've gone nearly as far as any of us want to, certainly not as far as President-elect Trump wants to, but I don't think that these are timid souls up here.
I appreciate your clarity.
Alan Larson, George Washington Law School. So the panel has produced exactly what I fear, which is, on the one hand, a cry that the Congress passes broad laws that allow the executive branch to do anything it wants. And at the same time, the Clean Air Act and maybe Dodd-Frank are criticized because they are much too detailed and they take away all the discretion from Congress, from the agencies. It's pretty hard to see that you can do both of those, satisfy both of them. And that's the problem with governance. The second thing is Congress passes laws because lots of people think that the idea behind it is good. So just to say that Congress shouldn't be passing any laws is not going to get anyplace. Third, as far as Schechter Poultry is concerned, it's probably, the decision itself is probably right because they turned everything over to the private sector. But I have litigated and unfortunately lost a bunch of cases in the Supreme Court in which the court has refused to extend delegation to the sentencing guidelines and Graham Rubin and a few other places because they don't want to rein it in, they don't know what the answer is. But then we get the situation, passing broad laws, and John is my case, so I have to take a little umbrage with Don Elliott. Part of the reason, aside from the constitutional reason that it was bad, was because Congress would pass bad laws, and then a single committee or a subcommittee would simply strike down the regulations which implemented them, and Congress could have their cake and eat it too. So I applaud the panel for its specific suggestions. I agree with some parts of some of them, but I think, regulatory reform by new gimmicks is not going to get us anyplace on itself.
So can anybody speak to this Goldilocks issue, right? Too vague, too specific.
David has supported the reviving of the delegation doctrine to no avail.
That's right. I mean, I tried. We lost in the Supreme Court, and my fallback was Reins. But I want to respond to your idea that how could these statutes be too broad, but yet too inflexible? Well, the answer is that Congress does not deal with the specifics. So in other words, it comes forth with platitudes. Protect health. Don't hurt that industry. Do this, do that, but it doesn't deal with the trade-offs. So we have a Clean Air Act that has 940 times does the Clean Air Act say shall to the administrator. Doesn't, by and large, however, the Clean Air Act doesn't say how much you should cut pollution. But where it has said that, there are a few places in the statute where it has, those have turned out to be great benefits. 90% cut in auto emissions for new cars. That got done. That's probably the biggest single thing that got done. Get rid of lead in the gasoline used by that new cars. That was a tremendous success. Other places where Congress said to the agency, oh, protect us from especially hazardous air pollutants. Well, not a darn thing was done for 20 years until Congress actually decided something and it began to get progress. Same with acid rain. The statute in 1990 said 50% cut in acid rain, and it got done. And so and as your old associate Ralph Nader said, when we're talking about these highfalutin absolutes like health, blah, 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 people go crazy. But when you get people down to the specifics, the kind of trade-offs we deal with in everyday life, then they can be sensible. He says that not in those words in his most recent book. He's right.
Could I say something about that? I do think we're really getting down to the issue here. I think Congress should legislate in generalities. I don't think Congress has the institutional capacity to make a lot of very detailed decisions. And I was involved in that 50% less of rain. The agency wrote that and gave it to Congress, and they enacted it. But I do think the problem here is there is no doctrine in American law that we've spent more time on with less success than the delegation doctrine. The basic idea of the delegation doctrine is to make the Congress decide more of the policy decisions. And I've given up on that. I think that when Justice Scalia wrote the decision in Whitman versus American Trucking in 2001, and even Justice Scalia was not willing to apply the delegation doctrine with any kind of vigor. So I think we've got to stop trying to either push policy decisions to the Congress or push them to the President. With all due respect to some of the good suggestions that other people have made, I think we have to accept the administrative state. We have to accept, as Jerry DeShaw, my colleague at Yale, wrote years ago, that administrators are going to make political decisions. They're going to make policy decisions. In a complex regulated society like we have, that's inevitable. You can't have the Congress and the President do it alone. So the problem and the challenge is to make the career bureaucracy more democratically responsible. And I'm open to different ways of doing that. I actually thought that the committee vetoes with rules was a good idea from a policy perspective. I gather we disagree about that. But whether or not we disagree about that, in one way or another, we've got to accept the reality of the administrative state and then think about how do we make it more politically responsible. Just to finish up, in a recent speech at the Federalist Society, Ben Sass talked about somebody he just described as the Marlboro Man. And the Marlboro Man was complaining about the Waters of the United States rule. And he said, I can't remember having voted for anybody at the EPA. And that, in a sense, encapsulates it. That we have platonic guardians who have lifetime tenure that are making most of the laws most of the time, and they have no democratic accountability or responsibility. That, in my view, is what we have to fix.
Well, can I add one thought, which is, I'm about to put on a conference at GW on driverless cars. And ask yourself, who should decide what we should do about driverless cars? Should we leave that to the states or the federal government? Should we leave it to Congress to try and write the rules about unknown and unknowable consequences? Or should we leave it to the bureaucrats?
I would suggest we leave the autonomous vehicles themselves.
I note that Alan didn't mention as even a possibility the market.
That's what I was going to say.
As you can tell, we've been talking about this for quite a while. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the panelists. Anyone who looked at the Everglades restoration knows that swamp draining is possible. But I think there are really some ideas here and some sentiments in the audience that need to find each other. So thank you.